In this story, you will follow the desperate journey of Ethan Miles, a lone traveler who becomes stranded inside a frozen canyon after a sudden blizzard seals both exits behind walls of ice. Over 5 brutal days, Ethan will battle frostbite, starvation, disorientation, and the haunting silence of a place untouched by warmth. With no tools, no food, and no way to call for help, he will be forced to rely on instincts he never thought he possessed, learning to survive by eating snow to stay hydrated and scraping bitter tree bark just to keep his body functioning. As the cold tightens its grip, Ethan must confront not only the physical dangers of nature, but the frightening truth that the greatest battle is sometimes the one fought inside the human soul. His emotional, spiritual, and physical journey through the frozen abyss will test every limit he has, revealing a transformation shaped by suffering, endurance, and unexpected glimpses of divine presence guiding him through the darkness. Ethan had always believed that true danger only existed in stories told around campfires or in cautionary tales from seasoned explorers. But as the storm swallowed the sky, he realized how fragile a human being truly is when nature decides to shift its weight. The canyon walls, once majestic and inviting, became towering prison bars of stone and ice. The temperature plummeted so fast he could feel the warmth leave his fingertips, as though the cold were pulling threads of life from his skin. In this frozen labyrinth, he wondered if anyone would ever know where he had disappeared. No footsteps marked the snow behind him. The storm erased his presence as quickly as he existed. The hunger arrived subtly at first, like an echo. Then it sharpened into a tormenting roar that clawed at his insides. With no wildlife in sight and no edible vegetation, Ethan felt the slow panic of a body beginning to shut down. Every sound, every drop of melting icicle, every gust of wind seemed amplified, as if the canyon were whispering warnings he could barely comprehend. His breath crystallized instantly, drifting upward like fragments of a forgotten prayer. It was in this moment of overwhelming weakness that he realized survival would demand choices he never imagined making. The first time he peeled bark from a frozen tree, his hands trembled, not from the cold, but from disbelief. It tasted bitter, earthy, almost nauseating. But as he forced himself to chew, he felt a small flicker of determination grow inside him. He knew he had to stay moving, stay breathing, stay believing. The canyon tried to suffocate hope with each passing hour, yet something deep within refused to break. Ethan couldn't explain it, but he sensed he wasn't alone. Even in the hollow stillness there was a presence, an indescribable warmth that didn't touch his skin but reached his spirit. On the 5th night, when darkness wrapped itself tightly around the canyon and his strength had nearly drained away, Ethan looked up at the sliver of sky visible between the stone walls. Stars shimmered through the icy haze, faint but unwavering. He felt a warmth in his chest, something that didn't belong in this world of snow and silence. He whispered a prayer, not out of ritual, but out of a soul stripped bare. And in that moment, he understood. The frozen canyon might have taken everything from him, but it had also revealed something he had never known he possessed, a faith deeper than fear, a resilience forged in the cold, and a promise that he would not be abandoned, even in the loneliest wilderness. Before we step into the freezing heart of Ethan's ordeal, I invite you to join this journey with us. If stories of survival, faith, and the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit move you, then make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me your country and city in the comments below. Your support helps this channel continue telling powerful, transformative stories. In this introduction, you'll learn who Ethan was before the canyon swallowed him, and how an ordinary man found himself face to face with extraordinary challenges that would reshape his soul. Ethan Miles was not a thrill-seeker or a hardened explorer. He was an office worker who had spent years living a predictable life, commuting, typing reports, sitting through long meetings that drained his passion one drop at a time. What pushed him toward the wilderness was not adventure, but a longing for clarity. Months of overwhelming stress had left him searching for something he couldn't name. He wanted silence. Not the kind that echoes through empty rooms, but the silence of nature, pure and untouched. When he arrived at the national park and saw the sprawling canyon for the first time, he felt something awaken inside him. The jagged cliffs, the whispering pine trees, the distant rush of the river. It all felt like an escape, a reset. He packed lightly, intending only a short solo hike. The forecast promised clear skies, and the winter sun shone gently on the frozen ground. Nothing hinted at the storm building beyond the horizon. Ethan had always admired nature's beauty, but had never respected its dangers. He underestimated how quickly conditions could change. He walked deeper into the canyon, marveling at the frost-covered rocks that shimmered like crystal under the sunlight. He didn't notice how still the air had become, how the wind had stopped whispering. It wasn't until a distant rumble echoed between the canyon walls that he sensed something was wrong. By the time the storm descended, escape was no longer possible. Snow fell with violent force, turning the sky into a white void. The path behind him disappeared beneath drifts of snow, and the canyon's narrow exit froze solid under sheets of ice. Ethan was trapped. In the moments before panic overtook him, he remembered a psalm his mother used to quote, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." He whispered the words softly, unaware that he would soon be living them in the most literal way imaginable. Ethan Miles first felt the true weight of the storm when the wind shifted from a gentle whisper to a violent roar, funneling through the canyon like a living creature awakened from slumber. Snowflakes that had once drifted lazily now whipped through the air in sharp, swirling patterns, stinging his face like shards of glass. He pulled his thin jacket tighter around his body, but it offered little protection against the sudden drop in temperature. The sky dimmed so quickly it felt as if the sun had been swallowed whole. He turned back toward the entrance of the canyon, hoping to retrace his steps, but the path he had walked minutes ago was already gone. Buried under a rising veil of white. Panic tightened his chest, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. He told himself this was temporary, that the storm would pass. Yet a sinking dread whispered otherwise. The canyon's towering walls, once a beautiful corridor of frozen rock, now loomed like the ribs of a giant beast. Snow piled along their edges, forming drifts that glowed faintly in the fading light. The storm's ferocity intensified until Ethan could barely keep his eyes open. His eyelashes froze together, and he wiped them with shaking fingers, only to feel the cold bite deeper into his skin. His phone offered no comfort. It had no signal, and the battery drained rapidly in the frigid air. He turned off the screen to preserve what little power remained, though deep down, he knew it wouldn't save him. The silence between gusts of wind felt ominous, as though the canyon were listening to him struggle. Ethan staggered forward, trying to find shelter before the storm grew even worse. Every step was a battle against the snow that clung to his boots and tried to drag him down. His breath came in ragged bursts, forming clouds that vanished almost instantly. He scanned the canyon for an alcove or overhang, anything that could offer protection from the wind. His fingers were already numb, and the cold crawled steadily up his arms. A wave of guilt hit him as he realized how unprepared he truly was. He had brought only minimal gear, assuming a short hike would be harmless. Now that mistake gnawed at him like a living thing. At last, he spotted a shallow indentation in the canyon wall, a hollow carved by centuries of wind and water. It wasn't much, but it could shield him from the worst of the storm. He forced his frozen legs to move faster, slipping on patches of icy ground as he approached the opening. When he finally ducked inside, the relief was immediate, though slight. The wind still howled outside, but its force no longer struck him directly. Ethan pressed his back against the cold stone wall, trying to conserve heat, but his body shivered uncontrollably. He rubbed his hands together, breathing warm air into his palms. But the cold refused to relent. He felt like a fire dwindling to its final embers. As he huddled in the shallow shelter, Ethan's memories drifted to his mother's voice, a tender, soothing sound that rose above the storm's rage. She had always told him to listen to God's whisper in moments of fear. Even when you feel lost, she used to say, you are never alone. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to cling to that promise, but fear pressed down on him like a weight. He had never prayed with such urgency, yet the words struggled to form on his trembling lips. All he could say, barely above a whisper, was, Lord, help me. The canyon swallowed his plea, offering no immediate answer. Night fell quickly, and the temperature dropped with ruthless determination. Ethan's body curled tighter as the cold seeped into his bones. He knew he couldn't fall asleep, not in this weather. Hypothermia could claim him silently, stealing his consciousness without warning, so he forced himself to stay awake, tapping his numb fingers against his thighs, shifting his weight every few minutes. The ground beneath him offered no comfort. It felt like ice wrapped in stone. His stomach growled with a deep ache, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since early morning. Hunger combined with cold created a dizzy fog that muddled his thoughts. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Ethan tried to keep track of time, but the darkness made it impossible. The storm raged on, showing no signs of easing. Every now and then, a distant crack echoed through the canyon, either falling ice or shifting rock. Each sound made his heart race. He imagined the canyon closing in on him, burying him under tons of snow and stone. His mind, stretched thin by exhaustion and fear, painted vivid pictures of what could happen if he remained trapped. Yet amid those terrifying images, a small, persistent thought kept returning. I have to survive. I have to make it out of here. When the wind finally weakened in the early hours of dawn, Ethan forced himself to rise. His legs trembled from the cold, and his joints felt stiff, as though they had aged decades overnight. Snow had accumulated at the entrance of his small shelter, forming a thick barrier that he had to push through with aching arms. The sky above was a dull gray, heavy with clouds that threatened more snowfall. Ethan stepped out cautiously, scanning the canyon. What he saw chilled him more deeply than the frozen air. Both ends of the canyon were blocked by massive formations of ice and snow. The storm had sealed him inside. He approached the nearest blockade, a towering wall of ice that stretched from one side of the canyon to the other. He touched the surface with his bare hand and winced as the cold burned his skin. It was impossible to climb. Even if he had the strength, the smooth, glassy surface offered no grip. The realization struck hard. He was trapped. Panic surged through him like a rush of fire, but he forced it back, reminding himself that fear would drain his energy even faster than the cold. He needed a plan, a way to conserve strength, to find water, to stay alive long enough for the canyon to release him. Ethan looked around at the snow-covered ground, searching for anything that could help him. Water, at least, was abundant in the form of snow. Food, however, was another matter. His eyes traveled to the nearby trees, thin, tall pines with rough bark. He remembered reading somewhere that the inner layer of certain tree bark contained nutrients. It wasn't appetizing, but it was something. Desperation nudged him forward. He approached one of the trees, chipped away at the outer bark with a sharp stone, and peeled off a thin strip of the pale inner layer. It tasted dry, woody, and bitter. But as he forced himself to swallow, he felt a spark of determination flicker inside him. This was the beginning of survival, not the glamorous kind seen in movies, but the raw, grueling kind that stripped a person down to instinct and faith. Ethan whispered softly, God, give me strength, and stepped deeper into the frozen canyon, ready to face whatever came next. The first full day trapped inside the frozen canyon tested Ethan in ways he never imagined a human body or spirit could be tested. The cold had settled into every joint, every muscle, every inhale that scraped like sandpaper down his throat. Morning brought no relief, only a pale glow that felt distant and indifferent. He walked slowly through the snow, trying to warm his stiff legs, but every step seemed heavier than the last. His stomach ached with a deep, twisting hunger that made his head light and his thoughts drift. He had known discomfort before: stress, worry, emotional exhaustion. but nothing compared to the raw, primal ache of a body demanding fuel it could not have. The canyon offered nothing but silence, stone and snow. It felt as though the world itself had forgotten him. Ethan tried to distract himself from hunger by focusing on tasks that could keep him alive. He scraped snow into his hands, letting it melt slowly in his mouth to hydrate himself without lowering his body temperature too much. The snow was clean and crisp, but its coldness numbed his tongue and chilled his core. He forced himself to move, pacing the length of the canyon floor to maintain warmth. His breath broke the silence in thick white gusts, but soon even those became faint as exhaustion dragged him downward. He stumbled several times, catching himself on the rough trunks of frost-covered pines. It wasn't long before he felt the first signs of faintness, a frightening disconnect between his mind and his limbs, as though his body were no longer entirely his. Instinct drove him to the trees again. The pine he had peeled the day before still bore fresh scars on its bark. Ethan approached a new one, pressing his forehead against the cold trunk as he struggled to gather strength. His fingers worked clumsily as he chipped away the outer bark, searching for the same pale inner layer he had eaten before. When he finally tore off a strip, he chewed it slowly, forcing himself not to gag at the earthy bitterness. Each swallow felt like chewing on strips of desolate winter itself, but it gave him a small boost of energy, a thread of strength he desperately needed. The bark left splinters on his lips, and the fibers stuck between his teeth, but he ignored the discomfort. His survival depended on these small, humbling acts. As Ethan chewed, memories of ordinary life flooded back. Warm meals, hot coffee, soft blankets. He hadn't realized how much comfort he had taken for granted until those comforts vanished completely. The canyon stripped him bare, leaving only a fragile human being wrestling with nature's brutal indifference. He wondered how long he could endure this, how many days his body could keep functioning with nothing more than bark and melted snow. He tried to calculate, but his brain felt foggy and slow. Numbers drifted out of reach like fragile ice crystals melting on his fingertips. What he did understand with frightening clarity was that every hour spent trapped in the canyon pulled him closer to the edge of collapse. Ethan forced himself to keep moving. Movement generated warmth, however small, and warmth meant life. He dragged his feet through the untouched snow, each step a reminder that no other human had walked here since the storm. He felt profoundly isolated, a tiny flicker of life in a world muted by frost. The silence pressed against him, heavy and unbroken. Even the wind seemed hesitant, whispering through the canyon only in soft, fleeting breaths. Ethan lifted his eyes to the canyon walls, wondering if rescue teams would even consider searching this deep into the wilderness. The storm had concealed all traces of his path. If he were to be found, it would take a miracle. As afternoon descended, the hunger sharpened again. An agonizing, clawing sensation that seemed to tear at his insides. Ethan bent over, gripping his stomach as waves of nausea washed through him. His vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment, he felt his knees buckle. He steadied himself against a tree and breathed deeply, trying to push past the sickness. "Stay awake," he murmured. "Stay moving." He repeated the words rhythmically, using them like a lifeline to keep himself grounded. His mother's voice resurfaced again, echoing faintly in his mind. God is near the broken-hearted. Ethan clung to those words, not because he felt strong, but because he felt utterly broken. As the light faded, Ethan began searching for shelter for the coming night. The shallow alcove he used previously would offer little warmth, but it was better than being exposed in the open. When he reached it, he noticed a large slab of rock partially buried in snow nearby. Using what little energy he had left, he pushed and dragged it toward the entrance of the alcove. It wasn't enough to close it off completely, but it created a crude barrier that shielded him from most of the wind. Inside, he curled into himself like a wounded animal. His fingers were stiff, the tips turning an alarming shade of pale blue. He rubbed them desperately against the fabric of his jacket, but feeling refused to return. Night descended with merciless speed. The stars above flickered faintly through thin streaks of cloud, their distant light offering no warmth. Ethan struggled to stay awake, but fatigue crushed him with a weight he couldn't fight. His eyelids drooped, and he leaned his head against the cold stone behind him. As he drifted, his mind wandered between memories and hallucinations, scenes of home, whispers he couldn't place, the soft hum of his mother praying beside his childhood bed. He saw warm lights, heard laughter, smelled soup simmering on the stove. But each time he reached for those comforts, they dissolved into frost that stung his skin. He forced his eyes open repeatedly, terrified of slipping into hypothermia's silent grasp. When he could bear the cold no longer, Ethan began whispering prayers, not out of habit, but out of desperation carved from the marrow of his soul. His voice trembled, barely audible over the faint rustle of wind. "Lord, don't let me die here. Not like this. Not alone." Tears welled up in his eyes, freezing before they could fall. The canyon offered no reply, yet something deep within him stirred, a fragile warmth that wasn't physical but spiritual. It wasn't enough to ease his suffering, but it moved him to keep fighting, to stay awake, to stay conscious. He clung to the sense that God was listening, even if the world around him remained cold and still. As dawn finally approached, Ethan felt as though he had endured a lifetime in a single day. His body was weak, his mind frayed, and his spirit stretched thin. But he had survived, by sheer will, by instinct, by desperation, and perhaps by grace. The faint light creeping into the canyon reminded him that another day had begun, and with it came the same brutal challenges: hunger, cold, and uncertainty. But there was also a spark, a tiny ember of determination still alive inside him. He pulled himself upright, shivering violently, and whispered, "One more day." The words hung in the frozen air like a fragile promise. Ethan stepped out of his meager shelter, knowing that day too inside the canyon had only been the beginning of the battle for his life. By the start of the third day, Ethan Miles felt like a ghost wandering a frozen world that had forgotten the warmth of the sun. His muscles ached from 2 sleepless nights, and every movement sent stabbing chills racing across his body. The canyon floor stretched before him like an endless corridor of white, broken only by the jagged shadows cast by towering walls of stone. Ethan walked slowly, leaning forward as if some invisible force dragged him back. His breath came in shallow bursts, and his mind drifted in and out of focus. Hunger gnawed at him with maddening persistence, while cold settled into the deepest parts of his bones. Yet despite the overwhelming exhaustion, something urged him onward, some faint conviction that stillness would mean death. The silence in the canyon had changed. It was no longer simply the absence of sound. It had become an oppressive presence of its own. Every step Ethan took seemed amplified, crunching through the snow with unnatural clarity. Even the wind had grown timid, brushing against the canyon walls in soft, hesitant sighs. Ethan paused often, convinced he heard something behind him. Footsteps, whispers, faint cracks echoing against the ice. Each time he turned, nothing moved. The emptiness played with his mind, twisting shadows into shapes and silence into murmurs. He knew the cold could alter perceptions, but knowing that didn't stop the uneasiness creeping across his spine. Ethan had no map of the canyon, no sense of distance or direction. The storm had erased all landmarks, leaving only a blank expanse that looked the same no matter where he turned. He followed the path between the towering walls, simply because there was nowhere else to go. As he walked, he ate small strips of pine bark he had saved from the night before, each bite a reminder of his fragility. The bitter taste coated his mouth, but it kept the dizziness at bay. The snow he melted with his breath provided hydration, but little warmth. He felt like he was slowly fading into the landscape, becoming just another forgotten piece of ice. By midday, the sky grew darker, even though no new storm had arrived. Thick clouds blotted out the sun, creating a dim and eerie twilight. Ethan stumbled upon a narrow passage off to the side of the canyon, a small crack between the rock walls. Something about it drew his attention. Maybe it was the way the light glimmered faintly within, or the instinctive hope that it might lead to shelter. Despite his exhaustion, he squeezed through the narrow entrance, scraping his jacket against the stone. Inside, he found a small cavern carved naturally by centuries of wind and water. The air was still, and the walls shimmered faintly with ice crystals that reflected what little light seeped in. Ethan sat down on the cold ground, grateful for the slight break from the relentless wind. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, closing his eyes as he rested his head against the stone wall. But the moment his eyes shut, a strange sensation washed over him. An unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. It felt like a gentle presence, a familiar comfort he couldn't explain. He opened his eyes sharply, expecting to see someone standing in the cavern with him. But he was alone. The silence deepened, and the faint sparkle on the icy walls almost looked like the shimmering remnants of whispered prayers. As he sat there, Ethan heard something unexpected. A distant crack, followed by a muffled thud, echoing from far deeper within the canyon. The sound jolted him upright. It wasn't the shifting of ice he had heard the previous nights. This was heavier, sharper, and unmistakably deliberate. His heart pounded in his chest. Was someone else here? Another traveler? A rescue team? The very idea sent a burst of hope through him, warming him more than any layer of clothing could. He crawled out of the cavern, scanning the canyon for movement, but the landscape lay still and untouched. The sound repeated, a hollow crack, then a thud, and Ethan felt a mix of fear and hope tangle inside his chest. Driven by desperation, Ethan followed the echoes. Each step was slow and careful, his boots sinking into the snow as he strained to listen. The sound became clearer as he moved deeper into the canyon. At times it felt close, as if hovering just beyond his reach. At other times it drifted away, swallowed by the vastness of the frozen walls. Ethan's pulse quickened. The thought of encountering another human filled him with equal parts relief and dread. What if it wasn't a person at all? What if the canyon itself was playing tricks on him? The cold could deceive senses, bending sound like fragile light through ice. The trail led him to a narrow bend where the canyon walls curved inward, forming a kind of frozen amphitheater. The sound was loudest here, a rhythmic crack, then silence, then another crack. Ethan's breath caught as he rounded the corner. His heart soared, and then plummeted. Before him stood a massive sheet of ice cleaving away from the canyon wall, slowly cracking apart under its own weight. The sound he had heard was nothing more than the canyon shifting, transforming under the pressure of the freeze. There was no one else here. No help. No footsteps but his own. The realization hit him like a blow, and he stumbled backward, his breath shaking as hope drained from his body like water spilling onto frozen ground. Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching the ice shift and fracture. The canyon groaned like some ancient creature adjusting in its slumber. He felt small, insignificant, and painfully alone. He pressed a hand against the nearest wall, grounding himself against the crushing weight of disappointment. Tears welled in his eyes, hot for a moment, then quickly freezing on his lashes. God. I thought, he whispered, voice breaking. But despite the sting of crushed hope, something inside him steadied. He realized that even though no human voice echoed through the canyon, he still wasn't entirely alone. That mysterious warmth he felt in the cavern lingered in his heart like a quiet reassurance. Ethan turned away from the shifting ice, forcing himself to walk back toward the center of the canyon. The disappointment weighed heavily on him, but it also forged a new determination within him. A resilience born not from strength, but from surrender. He didn't know how long he could survive. He didn't know how much more his body could endure. But he knew he had to keep going, keep moving, keep believing. The canyon had tested his body and mind, but now it was testing his spirit. And deep within the icy silence, Ethan Miles whispered a prayer, not for rescue, but for courage. As he surveyed the endless stretch of frozen wilderness ahead of him, he took a trembling breath and murmured, "Lord, lead me through." By the fourth day, Ethan Miles no longer recognized the sound of his own breathing. It came in thin, uneven threads, trembling with every inhale. His chest felt tight, not from injury, but from the cold that had seeped so deep it felt carved into his ribs. Every morning since the storm trapped him had been difficult, but this one felt nearly impossible. As he pushed himself upright from the frozen ground, he felt a sharp sting in his fingers, almost as if they were burning. But he knew the truth. They were likely beginning to freeze. He tried to flex them, grimacing at how stiff and slow they had become. The world around him remained brutally silent, and even though daylight filtered weakly through gray skies, the cold held a merciless grip that refused to loosen. The canyon seemed transformed today, as though it had grown narrower, more suffocating. Thick formations of ice pressed against the rock walls, glittering with deceptive beauty. Ethan walked slowly, dragging his boots through the snow that was now knee-deep in some places. His legs felt heavy, as if he were tethered to the earth by invisible chains. Hunger pulsed through his body like a slow drumbeat, weakening him more with every passing hour. He had eaten only a few small pieces of bark during the night, and they had done little to quiet the gnawing emptiness inside him. Every now and then, the world seemed to tilt or blur, forcing him to lean against the canyon wall until the dizziness passed. Ethan knew he needed to conserve energy, but standing still meant giving the cold more time to steal his body heat. Movement was the only warmth he could create, but each step forward required tremendous effort. He gathered snow in his hands and let it melt on his tongue, but the coldness only made his teeth ache. He forced himself to chew on another strip of pine bark, dry, fibrous, tasteless. It scraped against his throat like sandpaper, but it kept him conscious, and that was all that mattered. As he chewed, he glanced at the sky and whispered, "Just let me make it through today." The words escaped like a fragile breath, carried upward by hope rather than certainty. Midway through the canyon, Ethan's vision blurred suddenly, and his legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed into the snow, his palms sinking into the icy powder as a wave of disorientation washed over him. For a moment, he couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. All he saw was white. The cold beneath him seeped instantly into his limbs, numbing him further. He knew he couldn't stay down. He had read once that lying in snow meant surrendering to hypothermia. But his body refused to obey. He tried to push himself upward, only to slump forward again. Panic surged through him, quickening his breath. No, not here, he whispered frantically. The canyon answered with silence. Ethan forced himself to think. Anything that would stop the spiraling dread clawing at his mind. He remembered the cavern he had found the day before. The stillness, the faint shimmering light, the strange warmth he had felt. It hadn't offered food or fire, but it had offered a reprieve. He needed something like that now. He dug his hands into the snow and pushed himself upright again, trembling violently. Every step felt like dragging mountains behind him. He scanned the canyon walls desperately, searching for any indentation, any break in the rock that could shield him from the wind. Finally, after several agonizing minutes, he found a narrow overhang, smaller than the previous one, but enough to block the worst of the cold. Inside the shelter, Ethan crumpled against the wall, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He hugged himself tightly, rocking back and forth as he fought to regain control of his shivering. His fingers were stiff and discolored, and he feared frostbite was already setting in. He rubbed them together furiously, trying to generate friction, but the cold was too deep. A wave of despair washed over him, threatening to drown the fragile courage he had held on to since the first night. He felt tears rising again, hot, painful tears that froze before they could fall. "God, I'm trying," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm trying." Minutes stretched into hours. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind tangled between dreams and waking moments. He saw flashes of home, his mother's warm kitchen, the soft glow of the living room, the sound of laughter that once filled evenings. He tried to hold on to those images, but they scattered like snowflakes with each gust of wind. His body twitched involuntarily, the early signs of hypothermia tightening around him. He knew he had to move again soon, or sleep would take him. And in weather like this, sleep could be fatal. With tremendous effort, Ethan pulled himself to his feet. His legs trembled violently, but he forced them to hold him. He left the overhang and resumed his slow march through the canyon, leaning against any rock or tree he could reach. The light was fading quickly, and he knew another night was coming. He didn't know how many more nights he could endure. His thoughts grew hazy, and several times he thought he saw movement ahead, shadows that vanished the moment he blinked. At one point, he even thought he saw a figure standing near the far end of the canyon, but when he strained his eyes to focus, the shape dissolved into drifting snow. As darkness fell, Ethan found himself at the base of a jagged rock formation. It wasn't shelter, but the rocks created enough of a windbreak for him to sit and curl into himself. His body shook hard, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He felt the cold creeping deeper, squeezing his chest, slowing his heart. His breaths came shallow, and he knew he was dangerously close to slipping into a sleep he might never wake from. Desperation surged through him, and he whispered the only words he had left. "God, please stay with me. Don't let me be alone." For the first time in days, he felt something stir inside him. Not warmth exactly, but a quiet strength, as if an invisible hand rested gently on his shoulder. Through the long, brutal night, Ethan clung to that fragile sense of presence. Not comfort, not ease, just presence. It kept him awake when everything in him begged to sleep. When dawn finally arrived, he looked out across the canyon with eyes swollen, exhausted, and full of pain, but also full of something new. Endurance. He had survived another night. Somehow, miraculously, he was still alive. The sky remained bleak, and the canyon still trapped him with its frozen walls, but the voice within him whispered, "Keep going." Ethan pushed himself upright and whispered, "One more day." His voice cracked, but the determination remained. His journey through the frozen wilderness was far from over, but so was his will to fight. The dawn that broke on the 5th day arrived, not with warmth, but with a strange bluish stillness that seemed to echo inside the frozen canyon. Aiden Hayes awoke beneath the narrow overhang where he had spent the night, his body stiff, his breath shallow, and his mind caught between lucidity and the edge of collapse. He understood, with sobering clarity, that this day would decide everything. Either he would find a way out of the canyon, or the cold would take what little life he had left. His legs trembled before he even stood, and when he tried to rise, a sharp wave of dizziness forced him back down. But giving up was impossible. Survival had become more than instinct. It was now a vow, an inward declaration that he would not let his story end in silence, buried beneath the snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm that allowed the canyon's walls to reveal details he hadn't seen before. The winds had carved fresh lines in the snow, exposing pockets of rock that now glimmered faintly with morning light. Aiden took this as a sign, a reminder that even nature, indifferent as it was, sometimes opened small doors for those willing to push forward. He gathered the little snow he needed for hydration, scraping away the top layer to find clean crystals, then chewed on a strip of pine bark to quiet his hunger pangs. His stomach protested, but the bitterness grounded him, sharpened his senses just enough to act. He studied the terrain again and decided he would follow the curvature of the canyon floor until he found an incline that looked climbable. It was hope, thin and fragile, but hope nonetheless. Walking was a brutal task. Each step felt like dragging lead through icy water. His boots, soaked and stiff, grated against his feet, and the icy air stabbed through the torn lining of his jacket. But Aiden's determination grew with every breath that clouded the air in front of him. The canyon narrowed as he walked, funneling him into a corridor of shimmering frost. The silence was so absolute, it felt alive. as though the canyon itself was watching, waiting to see whether he would endure. Several times his legs buckled, and he caught himself against the rock wall, gasping, trembling violently. He whispered to himself words of encouragement, pieces of prayer, fragments of memory, anything to keep the spark inside him from flickering out. 2 hours passed before he found what he had been searching for. An incline that rose gently, not sharply, and was dotted with enough exposed rock to grip. Aiden stepped toward it with renewed purpose. The climb would be treacherous. His hands were numb, his vision blurred at the edges, and the snow atop the slope looked unstable. Yet staying below meant dying below. He approached the base and tested the first foothold. The stone was cold, but solid. He exhaled, set his shoulders, and began to climb. Every movement was deliberate, slow, calculated, precise. He pulled with everything he had, panting through clenched teeth, and bit by bit the canyon floor sank away beneath him. A small part of him feared looking down, not out of vertigo, but because he knew he lacked the strength to climb it twice. Halfway up, disaster struck. His right foot slipped on a patch of concealed ice, sending him sideways. His fingers scrambled desperately for purchase, and for a moment he felt himself falling. A primal surge of adrenaline shot through him, sharp enough to override exhaustion. He thrust his hand toward a protruding rock and caught it at the last possible second. The impact tore the skin from his palm, and the pain felt electric, but he held. His breath came in ragged bursts as panic threatened to flood him, but he closed his eyes, forced himself into the moment, and repeated silently, "I am not dying here. Not today." After several seconds, his pulse steadied. He adjusted his footing, found a new anchor, and continued upward, every inch earned through sheer will. When he reached the top of the slope, he collapsed onto the snow, chest heaving, face pressed against the freezing ground. For a while, he could not move at all. But gradually, the world steadied, and he pushed himself to his knees. This new plateau was still enclosed by canyon walls, but the terrain looked different, wider, more open, with a faint path carved by what might have been meltwater flows. The sky above was clearer here, revealing streaks of pale gold that hinted at afternoon light. Aiden followed the path, moving slowly, listening to the shift of snow beneath his boots. Birds passed overhead, a sign of higher elevation, a sign of life. For the first time in days, the canyon no longer felt like a tomb. As he continued forward, he heard something faint, something that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the frozen wilderness. At first, he couldn't place it. A dull hum, a mechanical echo. He stopped walking and held his breath. The sound persisted, soft, distant, but unmistakable. The low drone of an engine. Hope erupted inside him with the force of a breaking dam. He staggered toward the sound, though he didn't know the direction precisely. The canyon walls bounced the noise unpredictably, making it difficult to track. But he trusted his instinct and pressed on, calling out even though his voice cracked from cold and weakness. "Hey, I'm here! Help!" The canyon swallowed his cries, but he kept yelling, forcing sound from a throat nearly frozen. Minutes later, the hum grew louder. Aiden scrambled up a smaller rise and saw far ahead a flicker of movement, an orange shape shifting through the white landscape. It was a rescue team snowmobile. His knees nearly gave out from relief. He waved both arms, shouting with everything inside him. The snowmobile didn't seem to notice. It continued moving in a straight line, scanning the canyon from above. Aiden knew he had only one chance. He reached into his pack and pulled out the emergency mirror he had forgotten about until now, an object he had written off as useless under the storm's heavy clouds. The sun was finally strong enough. He angled the mirror toward the sky and flicked it sharply, sending flashes through the air. He repeated the motion again and again, praying, truly praying that someone would see. Then the snowmobile stopped. A figure stood, raised a hand to shield his eyes, and looked directly toward Aiden's position. Aiden felt his breath catch. The rescuer signaled, then climbed back onto the machine and accelerated toward him. The sound grew louder, clearer, until it filled the canyon. When the snowmobile reached him, 2 rescuers jumped off and rushed toward him. He tried to speak, but emotion closed his throat. His legs gave out, but arms caught him before he fell. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, checked his pulse, and gave him warm water in small sips. He heard snippets of their radio calls, their relieved exclamations, and the words, "We've got him." Aiden felt warmth, real warmth, for the first time in days, and tears stung his eyes. As they loaded him onto the snowmobile and began the journey out of the canyon, Aiden looked back one last time. The place that had nearly claimed his life now shimmered under the afternoon light, looking almost peaceful, almost benign. But he knew what it truly was: a crucible, a wilderness that had stripped him down to the rawest parts of himself and forced him to confront the fragile, fierce strength within. He breathed deeply, letting gratitude settle into his chest. He had survived, not by luck alone, but by endurance, faith, instinct, and the unyielding decision to keep moving, even when moving felt impossible. The canyon faded behind him, and as he closed his eyes, he felt the profound weight of the story he would carry for the rest of his life. When Ethan Miles finally left the frozen canyon behind, he carried with him more than frostbitten memories and the ache of 5 days spent battling the impossible. He carried a revelation, one that rose quietly within him like the first flame after darkness. In the silent hours before rescue, he had discovered the fragile yet unbreakable thread that binds a person to life. Not comfort, not certainty, but the relentless stirring of the spirit that whispers even when the body fails. Keep going. Sitting in the warmth of the rescue tent, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by people whose faces blurred with exhaustion and relief, Ethan realized that surviving had not been about strength alone. It had been about surrendering his fear, clinging to purpose, and trusting that even in the most desolate wilderness, God had not abandoned him. The canyon had tested him, reshaped him, and in the end, released him with a deeper humility and a greater awe for the one who whispered hope into the cold. In the days that followed, as he recovered in the small mountain clinic, Ethan often found himself replaying those moments when he felt closest to the end. The dizzy climbs, the hollow hunger, the vast silence that seemed capable of swallowing him whole. And yet every time he reached the memory of the 5th dawn, of hearing the distant hum of the rescue team, his chest tightened with gratitude. He knew that not everyone who enters such a wilderness returns. He understood that his survival was not simply a triumph of endurance, but a testimony of grace. Life, he realized, is painfully fragile and unimaginably precious. Every breath is a gift. Every sunrise is an invitation. And within the harshest landscapes, whether carved by nature or by circumstance, there are moments when God speaks the clearest, not through thunder or fire, but through the quiet strength he plants in the human heart. When Ethan eventually stepped outside the clinic, the world felt different, brighter, quieter, profoundly alive. The mountains no longer towered over him as threats, but as reminders of the journey that had changed him forever. He knew he would tell his story one day, not to impress or dramatize, but to remind others that even in the deepest canyons, literal or figurative, there is always a path toward hope. Sometimes it appears as a faint light, sometimes as the warmth of a stranger's hand, sometimes as the inner voice that refuses to be silenced. And as he breathed in the crisp mountain air, Ethan made a promise to himself, never again to take life for granted, and never to forget the presence that had walked with him through the snow, the hunger, the storm, and the silence. He had survived, and in surviving, he had been transformed.